Welcome to our channel. Here we learn new ideas and improve our English at the same time through stories. You practice English without feeling like you're studying. So let us start. Isaac Newton is usually remembered as the quiet genius who changed science forever, the man who explained motion, gravity, and helped build the foundations of modern physics. And that part is true. But it is only part of the story. Newton was also a deeply strange, private, and complicated man. Behind the image of the great scientist was someone obsessed with hidden truths, fascinated by alchemy, and willing to risk everything by writing ideas about religion that could have ruined him. So if most people picture Newton as a calm man with a wig and an apple, the real version was a lot more interesting than that. Newton was born on January 4, 1643, in Woolsthorpe by Colsterworth, a small town in Lincolnshire, England. He came into the world early and incredibly small. His mother later said he was tiny enough to fit inside a quart mug with room to spare. The doctor who delivered him did not think he would survive even a week. That is a rough welcome to life. Basically, Newton began his story by making doctors look bad. His father, who was also named Isaac Newton, had died 3 months before he was born. He had been a successful farmer, so the family was not poor, but Newton still entered life with a major absence hanging over him. For his first 3 years, his mother Hannah raised him alone. Then, in 1646, she remarried a man named Barnabas Smith. This changed Newton's childhood in a big way. He did not get on well with his stepfather, and much of his early upbringing happened under the care of his grandmother instead. His mother went on to have 3 more children with Barnabas: Benjamin, Mary, and Hannah. Newton seems to have had a decent relationship with his half-siblings, but his feelings toward his mother were much more difficult. In fact, when he was 19, he wrote down a list of sins he wanted to confess, and one of them was threatening to burn down the house with his mother and stepfather inside it. So yes, the young Newton was not exactly all peace, wisdom, and gentle candlelight. He attended a village school now and then, but his real formal education did not begin until he was 12, when he enrolled at the King's School in Grantham. At first, he was not impressive at all. He showed little interest in schoolwork and performed poorly. If someone had looked at him then and said, "This boy will one day rewrite physics," people probably would have laughed and gone back to lunch. But then, something changed. Newton suddenly became serious about his studies. Part of that seems to have come from rivalry. He had been bullied by another student, and instead of only fighting back physically, he decided to beat the boy academically too. And once Newton decided to compete, he did not do things halfway. He threw himself into learning and became the top-performing student of 1660, showing an extraordinary talent across subjects. When Newton was 17, his stepfather died. His mother then tried to pull him out of school and turn him into a farmer. On paper, that probably made sense. The family had land, and the oldest son could help provide for everyone. The problem was that Newton had absolutely no interest in farming. He hated the thought of spending his life in the fields. Thankfully for science, and honestly probably for the crops too, the headmaster of King's School stepped in and convinced his mother to send him back. That decision changed history. In June 1661, Newton entered Trinity College, Cambridge. He had to support himself by doing odd jobs, like serving meals and running errands for wealthier students and professors. He originally came there with the goal of becoming a minister in the Church of England, which may sound surprising considering how things turned out later. At some point during his first year, though, he began moving away from that path. The exact reason is not completely clear, but his later writings show that he was developing religious views that did not fit comfortably with Anglican teaching. At Cambridge, the official curriculum still leaned heavily on Aristotle. Newton studied those ideas, but he quickly became frustrated with how much of traditional learning rested on authority rather than proof. He was fascinated by people like Descartes, Kepler, and Galileo, thinkers whose work had challenged accepted beliefs. Since many of these newer scientific ideas were not fully embraced by the university establishment, Newton often studied them on his own. That became one of the defining things about him. He did not just memorize ideas, he tested them. He argued about them. He wanted to know whether they were actually true. In 1662, he filled a notebook with 45 questions he wanted to investigate, mostly about the physical world. That may not sound dramatic, but it matters. Other students might study what great men had already said. Newton looked at the world and started asking, "Yes, but how do we know?" That habit, more than anything else, was the beginning of Isaac Newton, the revolutionary thinker. At Cambridge, Newton's mind began pulling away from the standard path laid out for him. Officially, students were still taught through the old framework of Aristotle, and that meant a lot of accepted ideas were treated almost like settled truth. Newton was not comfortable with that. He respected learning, but he did not like being told something was true just because an important man had said it hundreds of years earlier. That attitude would shape his whole life. So while many students stayed close to the official syllabus, Newton started building his own private education. He read the work of Descartes, Kepler, and Galileo, thinkers who had challenged older ideas and tried to explain nature through observation and mathematics. Newton absorbed all of this eagerly. He was not the kind of student who wanted to repeat clever arguments. He wanted to test them, improve them, and, if necessary, break them apart completely. In 1662, he made a long list of questions he wanted to investigate, around 45 in total, mostly connected to what we would now call physics. That list matters because it shows the way he thought. He was not just curious in a vague way. He was methodical. He looked at the world and started identifying problems that needed answers. And unlike many people before him, he did not stop at the question. He began designing ways to solve them. Then, in 1663, his attention shifted hard toward mathematics. He became fascinated by the work of René Descartes, especially the blending of algebra and geometry. That interest grew quickly into something much deeper. Newton started seeing mathematics not just as a subject, but as a tool powerful enough to unlock the structure of nature itself. He graduated from Trinity in August 1665. His official grades were respectable, but not nearly as spectacular as his true ability. That was probably because so much of his energy went into his own studies rather than the formal course requirements. In other words, Newton was already too busy inventing the future to fully optimize his report card. Then history stepped in. At that time, the bubonic plague was devastating Europe. In London, around 1 in 4 people died. Universities shut down to try to slow the spread of disease, and Newton had to leave Cambridge. On paper, this interruption might have looked like terrible timing. In reality, it became one of the most productive stretches of intellectual work in history. For the next 2 years, Newton stayed at the family home in Woolsthorpe. Cut off from normal university life, he focused on his own research. His main interests during this period were calculus, optics, and the motion of the moon and planets. He had time to think, and that was dangerous in the best possible way. During these years, Newton asked some of the biggest questions in science. Why do things always fall downward? Why does the moon not fall to the earth? Why do planets stay in orbit instead of flying off into space? These were not small questions, and Newton believed mathematics could answer them. So he developed a new mathematical method that he called fluxions, which became the foundation of what we now know as calculus. He later looked back on this period and said it was the prime of his age for invention. That was not an exaggeration. In those quiet plague years, Newton laid the groundwork for some of the most important ideas in scientific history. When he returned to Cambridge in 1667, he was only 23, but he had changed. He had become more withdrawn, more intense, and more absorbed in his own inner world. People around him often saw him as odd, absent-minded, and solitary. He had few, if any, close friends. But while others may have thought he was just a strange recluse, Newton was privately wrestling with the structure of the universe. He became a fellow of Trinity College, which gave him security and status, and in 1669 he published his first major mathematical work, Analysis by Infinite Series. It focused on equations and curves in 3 dimensions, and it attracted serious attention from the wider scientific world. Newton was no longer just a gifted student. He was becoming known as a first-rate mathematician, but there was a problem attached to his academic success. As a fellow at Cambridge, he was expected to become an ordained priest in the Church of England. Newton did not want that. By now, he had serious religious objections to important church doctrines, especially the Trinity, which he could not accept. That put him in a dangerous position. England was not a place where you casually disagreed with official Christian doctrine and expected everyone to shrug. Still, his academic rise continued. When he was appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, one of the most prestigious roles in the university, pressure grew again for him to enter the priesthood. Newton managed to delay the requirement, at least for a time, and moved fully into the role. Now, at just 27, he held one of the top mathematics positions in the country. As Lucasian professor, he was supposed to lecture regularly and place copies of his notes in the university library. Newton, being Newton, did not always feel especially bound by ordinary expectations. But he did begin lecturing on a subject that had fascinated him for years, optics. And this is where he started changing science yet again. As Lucasian professor of mathematics, Newton had one of the most respected academic positions in England. He was supposed to lecture on mathematics, file his notes properly, and behave like a distinguished scholar. Newton, of course, did some of that, but in his own very Newton-like way. He often ignored the ordinary routines of the job, and instead followed whatever problem had grabbed his mind at the moment. And during this period, one of the biggest things pulling at him was light. Newton began lecturing on optics, the study of light and vision. He wanted to understand what light actually was and why it behaved the way it did. One of the major issues people struggled with involved the refracting telescope. These telescopes used lenses, but lenses had a frustrating habit of bending different colors of light by different amounts. That meant the image could blur, with colors not lining up properly. Newton tried to solve the problem, but eventually realized the issue was built into the very design. So instead of endlessly arguing with the lens, he changed the telescope. In 1668, Newton built the first practical reflecting telescope using mirrors instead of lenses. This was a huge step forward. It avoided the color distortion that plagued refracting telescopes and showed just how inventive Newton could be. He was not only someone who could think through abstract theory. He could also build things with his hands and solve technical problems in clever ways. Using his telescope, he observed the night sky and saw, among other things, the 4 moons of Jupiter. Not bad for a man who had once been told he should probably just go farm. His work on light also helped bring him into a bigger scientific world. In 1671, he was nominated for membership in the Royal Society, the leading scientific organization in England. To support his candidacy, he sent them a paper on the nature of light. It was read aloud at one of their meetings. The reaction was mixed. Some members were impressed. Others strongly objected. Newton had argued that white light was not pure and simple, but actually made up of different colors. That challenged a lot of accepted thinking. It was a bold claim, but Newton had backed it up with experiments using prisms. He was admitted to the Royal Society in 1672, which marked his entry into the official scientific establishment. And then, almost immediately, the trouble started. One of the most important figures in the Royal Society was Robert Hooke, the curator of experiments. Hooke was brilliant, energetic, and very public in the way Newton was not. He liked debate. He liked attention. And he did not like some of Newton's claims about light. What followed was a long and bitter argument. Hooke published objection after objection, and Newton answered back. Over several years, the dispute dragged on and became deeply personal. Newton hated this. He did not enjoy public quarreling, and he especially did not enjoy having his ideas attacked by loud, confident men in wigs. After about 15 months, he resigned from the Royal Society. The Society's secretary, Henry Oldenburg, tried to persuade him to stay, telling him he was highly respected, but Newton withdrew for the next couple of years. This is one of those moments that really shows his personality. He was brilliant, but he was also thin-skinned, intensely private, and not built for academic small talk or endless committee drama. At the same time, another problem was building around him at Cambridge. Newton still had not taken holy orders, and his refusal was becoming awkward for the university. His position as a fellow was supposed to require ordination in the Church of England, and now that issue could no longer be quietly ignored. Newton turned to his old mentor, Isaac Barrow, for advice. Barrow suggested that he appeal directly to King Charles II for a special exemption. So Newton went to London in 1675 and asked the king for a dispensation, allowing him to remain in his university post without becoming a priest. To his surprise, it worked. Not only was Newton personally exempted, but the king also removed the ordination requirement for future holders of the Lucasian chair. That was an extraordinary outcome, and it mattered because Newton's religious views were far from orthodox. He deeply rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, which was a dangerous opinion at the time. This was not just a mild theological disagreement. In that era, openly denying central church doctrine could be treated as heresy, and heresy could ruin, imprison, or even kill you. So while the public saw Newton as a scholar rising in mathematics and science, he was privately becoming something much more complicated, a man whose views on religion put him quietly at odds with the world around him. Then, in 1680, a bright comet appeared over England. It caught the attention of scientists across the country, including Newton and an ambitious young astronomer named Edmund Halley. A few years later, in 1684, Halley visited Newton to discuss the shape of planetary orbits. That conversation changed everything. Halley was amazed by what Newton told him and urged him to write it all down. Newton agreed, and once he began, he threw himself into the work so completely that he often forgot to eat or sleep. The result would become one of the most important books ever written, Principia Mathematica. Once Edmund Halley pushed Newton to write down his ideas properly, Newton threw himself into the project with almost frightening intensity. For about 18 months, he worked on what became Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, usually shortened to Principia. He became so absorbed in it that he often forgot basic things like eating and sleeping, which, to be fair, is one way to finish a masterpiece, though not one most doctors would recommend. In this huge work, Newton pulled together nearly 20 years of thought, calculation, and observation. He began by defining core ideas like matter, motion, inertia, momentum, and mass. Then he introduced the ideas that would change physics forever. His 3 laws of motion. First, an object keeps doing what it is doing unless something forces it to change. Second, force causes acceleration. Third, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. They sound simple now, almost too familiar, but that is partly because Newton made them feel so clear that later generations built entire sciences around them. Then came the biggest step of all, universal gravitation. Newton argued that the same force pulling an apple downward also keeps the moon in orbit and governs the motion of the planets. That was revolutionary. For nearly 2,000 years, people had largely accepted the old Aristotelian view that heavenly bodies followed one set of rules, while earthly objects followed another. Newton said no, the universe works under one system. Heaven and earth are not separate machines. They obey the same law. That idea changed everything. When Principia was presented to the Royal Society in 1686, Robert Hooke immediately accused Newton of taking ideas from him. Newton, unsurprisingly, did not enjoy this. Still, the book moved forward, and when it was published in 1687, it was recognized as a masterpiece. It gave the scientific world a new framework for understanding motion, planets, tides, falling bodies, and the mechanics of the universe itself. Even so, Newton's ideas were so advanced that universities were slow to teach them. In some places, it took another 50 years before his system was properly adopted. By then, Newton was famous, but fame did not make him simple. In fact, one of the most surprising things about Newton is that while he was building modern science, he was also deeply involved in alchemy. Yes, alchemy. The same field associated with hidden formulas, ancient symbols, and people trying to turn base metals into gold. It sounds completely at odds with the image of the perfectly rational scientist, but Newton spent enormous amounts of time on it. He had first become interested in alchemy while still at Cambridge. Over the years, he collected books on the subject, filled thousands of pages with notes, and carried out hundreds of experiments in private. He was searching for what he thought might be deeper truths about matter, change, and the hidden structure of reality. In his mind, this was not nonsense. It was another road toward universal truth. So Newton basically helped invent modern physics, while also secretly doing the intellectual version of, what if this weird glowing powder changes everything? At the same time, he was writing huge amounts on religion. In fact, over the course of his life, he wrote more than 1 million words on theological subjects. Very little of that was published while he was alive, and for good reason. Newton had come to believe that mainstream Christianity had drifted away from the teachings of Jesus. Most importantly, he rejected the Holy Trinity, which was a dangerous belief to hold in public. In that period, openly denying the Trinity could be treated as heresy, and heresy could bring serious punishment. Newton was not casually questioning things. He was doing deep study in Hebrew, analyzing scripture carefully, and trying to reconstruct what he believed was the original Christian truth. He also became fascinated with biblical prophecy, especially the books of Daniel and Revelation, and with the design of Solomon's temple, which he believed held clues to the structure of the universe and the future of humanity. So while the world knew him as the man of mathematics and gravity, Newton privately lived a second intellectual life that would have shocked many of his admirers. In 1689, Newton entered public life when he was elected as Cambridge's representative in Parliament. This brought out a different side of him. The man who had once seemed painfully withdrawn became more confident and sociable in public service. During the 1690s, he suffered a period of depression and mental exhaustion, but recovered and continued working, especially on problems involving the moon's orbit. Then, in 1696, he accepted a major government job as Warden of the Royal Mint, which took him to London. He later became Master of the Mint, and this was not just a decorative title. Newton took the work seriously, overseeing the recoinage of English money and improving the accuracy and standardization of the currency. He brought the same precision to coinage that he brought to science. It also paid very well, which probably did not hurt. In 1703, Newton became president of the Royal Society, a position he held until his death. In 1705, he was knighted by Queen Anne, becoming Sir Isaac Newton. But even in these later years, his life was not free from conflict. One of the biggest disputes of the era was over calculus, with both Newton and the German scholar Gottfried Leibniz claiming priority. Newton had developed the key ideas first, but Leibniz published before him, and the argument split Europe's scientific community. During the last years of his life, Newton revised Principia, worked on biblical history, and carefully shaped how he would be remembered. He sat for portraits, had sculptures made, and at the same time spoke with an outward humility that became famous. He once said that he felt like a boy playing on the seashore while the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him. It is a beautiful line, and probably one of the rare moments in history where a man who had already changed the world still managed to sound modest. In old age, Newton lived with his niece, Catherine Barton Conduit, and her husband. His health slowly declined. He suffered breathing problems, then severe pain from a kidney stone. By March 1727, his condition had worsened badly, and in the early hours of March 31, 1727, Isaac Newton died. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, one of the highest honors in England, and his funeral was the grandest ever given there for a natural philosopher. And that really says it all. Newton was not just a brilliant scientist. He was a man full of contradictions, logical but mystical, public but deeply private, revolutionary in science, and rebellious in religion. He helped explain how the universe moves, yet spent much of his life chasing truths other people thought were hidden or forbidden. That is what makes the real Isaac Newton so fascinating. He did not just change science. He changed the way human beings think about truth itself. All right. If you made it through this session today, that already says something about your discipline. This repetition and consistency combination might look boring on paper, but it is one of the most powerful ways to build fluent, natural English. Keep showing up like this, and your brain will slowly adapt. Trust the process. If this helped even a little, consider liking the video or subscribing. It lets me know these sessions are actually making a difference. We'll catch up again soon. Take care till then.